You probably imagine a dozen new things a day, and in fact, I can make you imagine something new right now. The hottest day of the summer so far was drawing to a close, and a drowsy silence lay over the large square houses of Privet Drive. But what is imagination? What are you doing when you did that thing that you just did? The obvious answer is that you are forming a mental picture of the house that Harry Potter grew up in. You are taking some sensory impressions and putting them together in the shape of a house. A little bit like when you remember something, you remember how it looked, or how it sounded, or how it tasted or smelled. You take sense impressions and put them together. The image, for want of a better word, that you form is sensory. However, that's just one type of imagination, called imaging. Not all imagination is sensory. For instance, imagine that there are 1 billion fish in the Atlantic Ocean. I assume that you have no trouble imagining that, but I'm also willing to bet that you didn't just image exactly 1 billion fish. So we need a broader account to explain all the different ways that you can use your imagination. And we're going to look at 2. The cognitive model of imagination draws from a particular theory of mind called functionalism. Functionalism is the idea that a mental state can be defined by A, its relations to other mental states, and B, what outputs it gives when given certain inputs. So the idea is that what it is to be in a mental state and what kind of mental state it is depends on what it does. Imagination is a very similar mental state to belief. Both imaginings and beliefs are experienced by you. They're not unconscious mental states. They both affect your emotions. You can use them both to infer other things. But imagination and belief are also importantly different. For instance, belief is much more closely linked to perception. If you see that a tiger is running towards you, you will probably believe it. You just imagined a tiger, didn't you? And you didn't run away from your computer, which tells us something else rather important. Belief is much more closely linked to action. If you believe that a tiger is coming toward you, you will probably take some action that you wouldn't take if you merely imagined it. Another important difference is that imagination is under voluntary control. You can imagine whatever you want, but you cannot control your beliefs. Footnote. I've said before on the show that you can't control your beliefs. I was talking about religious beliefs in particular, and a lot of people disagreed. Now, the involuntariness of belief is something that I don't really have time to go into here, and it could form the basis of its own episode in the future. But if you disagree and think that you can control your beliefs, then don't worry, you can just leave that bit out of the cognitive model of imagination without scuppering the rest of it. And that's the cognitive model of imagination. Imagination is a mental state, and we define that mental state in terms of its inputs, outputs, and relations to other states. For the analytic model, once again we're going to compare belief and imagination, but this time it's as an illustration rather than as part of the definition. Take a proposition, any proposition you like the sun is 10 million degrees. If you believe that, then you are committed to its truth. Believing it means that you think it's true. You couldn't sensibly say that you believe it and think that it's false. That's because belief is essentially truth-directed. Whereas, if you merely imagine it, truth doesn't come into the picture. You could say that it's true or false. You aren't constrained. You merely entertain the proposition. You have it in mind. Berys Gaut says that unlike belief, imagination stands in a neutral relation to the truth. And this goes for imaging too. You can image an open meadow without being committed to saying that it is true that it exists. And that is the analytic model. So which model is correct? Well, clever viewers may already have noticed that they are in fact compatible. That's right. You can believe them both. The cognitive model says that there are these differences between belief and imagination, and the analytic model goes one step further and explains those differences in terms of commitment to the truth. So why bother having 2 accounts? Well, that's to do with whether or not you accept functionalism, which not everyone does. The analytic model is slightly more basic, so you can use it to say what imagination is, even if it turns out that the cognitive model has said some specific things about it that aren't true. So what is imagination? It is the capacity to entertain representational states of mind without being committed to their truth. Incidentally, Imagination is also the name of a British post-disco funk band founded in 1981, so if you've come here looking for them, then you're in the wrong place. The music section of YouTube is down the hall and then on the right. What do you guys think? What is imagination? Do you prefer the more technical cognitive model or the more fundamental analytic model? As usual, a list of recommended readings is in the description. Next time we could either do some more on hedonism, since so many people enjoyed that last time, or we could do should smokers get lung transplants? Now isn't that a very weighty question? For more philosophical videos every Friday, please subscribe. Also, one other thing that's really quite amazing, I don't know if you guys have heard of a show called Leaders Live. It's where they get the heads of the major UK political parties to be interviewed by YouTubers, and they ask them questions from their fans on social media live. I might have a chance to do that with Nicola Sturgeon, who is the head of the Scottish National Party and also First Minister of Scotland, the head of the Scottish government. I think that would be amazing, but I said I would ask you guys first, because Philosophy Tube isn't just me, it's all of us. So if that's something you'd be interested in seeing, if you've got questions that you'd want me to ask the head of the Scottish government for you, then get in touch with me on Twitter, because that's where it's all going to be happening. I think that would be so totally cool. Like, she is the most powerful woman in the country with the exception of the Queen, and she doesn't really count because she's not supposed to be political. So if you want to see me talk to the most powerful woman in British politics, then get in touch with me on Twitter. This episode was sponsored by Intimidating Scones, Rich Clarke, DJ MacIsaac, Looking Glass Universe, and a bunch of other people whose names are in the description. Thank you, all of you guys, for your generosity. You're keeping the show going, you're keeping me going, and if you'd like to sponsor the show in exchange for rewards, then you can find me on Patreon. Last time we asked how many objects are there in the universe, so let's see what you guys had to say. First and foremost, there might have been a bit of a mistake with the maths in the last episode. Like I said, I farmed out the maths to somebody else because I haven't studied maths since I was 16. It might be that Marissa's number, which, if you remember, is the number of objects in the universe according to universalism, one of the theories we were discussing, is actually much, much bigger than we calculated it to be. Interestingly though, there were lots of different answers in the comment section as to what it should be, so maybe if I make things a little bit clearer, somebody will be able to figure it out. So there are 10 to the 80 fundamental particles in the universe. According to mereological universalism, any arrangement of them counts as an object. So one fundamental particle on its own, that's an object. Two fundamental particles, they're an object. And it doesn't matter what the arrangement is, what order you look at them in, whether or not they're touching each other, none of that. As long as they exist, they count as an object. So if you only had two fundamental particles, you've got three objects. You've got the first particle, the second particle, and the object that is composed of both of them, no matter where they go or how they travel through the universe. So that's all clear. See if someone can figure out how many objects there are. Also, we were talking about some of the weird objects that universalism says exists, like the object composed of a trout and a trout turkey, and Crimsanity made a trout turkey for us. Thank you, Crimsanity! That is terrifying! If anyone else has any art or anything for me that they want to send in, then do send it in and I'll try and feature it both on the show and in my nightmares. The rest of the comments were largely divided into two groups. The first group was saying that an object is whatever we stipulate it to be, or whatever people say is an object, or some other ideas along the same lines. Unfortunately though, because people could disagree about whether something is or isn't an object, or potentially change their minds, that would mean that our answer would include vagueness, which we argued it could not possibly do. So kudos to everybody who tried to make a reply along those lines, but unfortunately the problem still remains. The second group was saying, with varying degrees of politeness, that the question of how many objects there are in the universe isn't a substantive question or isn't a sensible or important question. Now, philosophy is always accused of not really asking important questions, but in this case, you might actually be right. It has been argued that the universalism-nihilism debate is merely verbal. It's not a substantive question. That is actually a proper metaphilosophical position that has been defended. Now, of course, in order to defend that position, you would have to say, in virtue of what is some philosophical debate not substantive or not important or not making sense to ask the question. And to do that is to do philosophy. As for the obvious other question, why bother making a video about it if you knew that it might not be a substantive question? Well, because it might well be a substantive question, it hasn't been shown conclusively that it's not, and also, even if it isn't, the debate is an interesting way of coming to realise that the question of how many objects there are in the universe is not a legitimate question to ask. And the reason it might well be a substantive question was captured brilliantly by Abraxian absolution. Nihilism says that there are fundamental particles. If there are no fundamental particles, then nihilism is wrong, which means that universalism must be correct, because, as we argued, those are the only two options we could have. This is called the atomless gunk problem for nihilism, and well done for anticipating it. That's all the time we've got this week. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye! Imagination is a mental state, and we define that mental state in terms of its inputs, its outputs. For the analytic model, once again, you can believe them both. Do you prefer the more technical cognitive model or the more fundamental?